One.
This is a Bendigo Writers Festival backstory. Welcome to everyone. I'd like to start by thanking publishing house Scribe and Bendigo Venues and Events for their support for this event. And of course, particularly like to thank Antony Dapiran, author of today, for a terrific book that he's written. Here it is. And I might say at the start, I lived in Hong Kong myself for a few years, and earlier this year was back. I'm often back there. And always I'm reminded when I go to Hong Kong, even in present time, that in my view, there are two great cities in the world. One is New York, one is Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is the greater, of course. And Antony in his book talks about Hong Kong people referring to themselves as Saint Man, meaning people of the city, which is something like people in ancient Rome used to describe themselves. So it's a very important book about an important and marvelous place in many ways. On my visit earlier this year, I couldn't help but see graffiti there, and Antony writes in the book about graffiti unusual in Hong Kong, graffiti like City of Tears and police everywhere, justice nowhere. And I went with a Hong Kong friend of mine to Tai Po and looked at the Lennon walls with their amazing profusion of post-it notes. So we have been in 2019, as the book says, in the center of the revolution of our times. What's it like there today, Antony? All quiet on the Hong Kong front?
Yes, well, obviously the coronavirus, which has put a stop to so much activity around the world, has also put a stop to the regular street demonstrations that we've been seeing here in Hong Kong for many months last year and continuing on into this year. But despite the lack of large public gatherings on the streets, I think the spirit of defiance still remains very strong. So people are still talking about their discontent with the government. They're expressing that in different ways, whether that's online or through smaller gatherings, or even through things as simple as patronizing local businesses that have visibly affiliated themselves with the pro-democracy movement, the so-called yellow circle economy. And through these different means, they are keeping the spirit of the protest alive. And I dare say that as now in Hong Kong, we're actually already preparing to emerge from lockdown. We've had 0 cases for many days over the last week. The Hong Kong Civil Service are going to go back to work next week. And I think the government is in a phased way looking to begin to reopen daily life here from an economic point of view. And I think as that happens, we are likely to see the daily protest life coming back to life as well in the coming weeks and months ahead.
You wrote a very interesting article for Foreign Policy magazine in the last few days, saying that despite this, Beijing has taken advantage of the global destruction that is coronavirus in order to, according to its program, make progress in sorting out Hong Kong. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit about that, including obviously the arrests of some very famous people, and you might talk about who they are. Thanks.
Yeah, certainly. So it was clear that Beijing was never going to tolerate the open defiance that Hong Kong showed of Beijing's rule over the last half of last year. Yet last year, Beijing was relatively restrained in its response. And I think people were obviously had feared the worst at certain points last year of Beijing intervening perhaps with force in Hong Kong, but that didn't happen. But there was always a sense that Beijing's revenge would come eventually. And really, in the last few weeks, while the rest of the world's attention has been focused on matters such as the coronavirus, Beijing has begun to reassert their control over Hong Kong and really tighten their grip over Hong Kong. And that happened in particular over the last 2 or 3 weeks, and with a number of key moves that Beijing has made. Firstly, they marked a National Security Awareness Day with a number of very bellicose statements from both Beijing and Hong Kong government leaders talking about the need for a national security law in Hong Kong to counter the threats of against national security, including threats of what they're calling homegrown terrorism, which is the way they're trying to characterize the protesters. So there's a sense that they're going to begin a national security directed crackdown. Secondly, and quite controversially, Beijing claimed for themselves and for their departments that oversee Hong Kong, effectively a unilateral and inherent right just to interfere in Hong Kong affairs. Now, this was very controversial because under the basic law, under which is Hong Kong's constitution and the one country, two systems framework under which Hong Kong was returned to Chinese rule, one of the provisions of that basic law is that Beijing is not allowed to interfere in the governance of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is supposed to have a high degree of autonomy in governing itself. Well, now, after some 23 years, Beijing has emerged to say that actually they feel that their departments responsible for Hong Kong policy do have an inherent right to what they call supervise the governance of Hong Kong. And that's caused a great deal of concern that Beijing is going to far more directly interfere in the governance of Hong Kong in the future. And then the third and really major development, which you just alluded to, Rowan, was the arrest of 15 very prominent pro-democracy activists and senior politicians a couple of weeks ago, all for charges in relation to the protests that occurred last year. Now, of course, there have been thousands of arrests during the protests over the last 7 months of 2019. As many as 7,000 arrests were made. But these arrests a couple of weeks ago were really different in terms of the people they arrested. They targeted for arrest the most senior, and I think I'd have to say the most respected among Hong Kong's so-called pan-democrat politicians, and in particular, people that have been really voices of moderation. So these included people like Martin Lee, who was really a senior statesman figure, the founder of the Hong Kong Democracy Party. He was himself a member of the committee that drafted the basic law, now some 81 years of age, a very senior and highly respected figure. He was arrested, as was Margaret Ng, a senior counsel, a very well-respected barrister, another senior figure in the pro-democracy movement, media magnate Jimmy Lai, many other senior politicians from the pan-democrat parties, as well as protest leaders. And I think through these arrests, Beijing was really sending a sign that they intended to crack down on very strongly on anyone involved in the protests, and by arresting and charging these most senior figures, a sense that even these voices of moderation were no longer going to be tolerated. And in Beijing's, the classic sort of Maoist dichotomy of the people and the enemies of the people, Beijing now seems to be painting anyone affiliated with the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong as an enemy of the people and treating them accordingly. And so that has been seen through Beijing's rhetoric and their actions over the last few weeks. So I think it's, in summary, where we're now beginning to see Beijing's response finally to the events of last year.
Quite disturbing. And some people have portrayed the arrests as being attempts to keep, to destabilize the pro-democratic movement in the lead up to quite important elections coming up in November for LegCo, for the Legislative Assembly. Last year we had elections for local government, which resulted in some quite remarkable changes. Previously, 2015, there were 126 broadly pro-democratic councillors elected and 298 pro-Beijing. A few months ago, changed dramatically, 385 pro-democracy and only 59 pro-Beijing. And so I guess there's concern in that camp as to what might happen in November. Would you like to elaborate on that and what role elections play? Because people think elections have no role in Hong Kong, but they do, don't they?
They do, yes. So those elections last year that you mentioned, the local council elections, were really quite remarkable. They came really at the peak of the protests after months of protests, and there were always going to be a referendum on the protest movement. And I think the government in Beijing had felt all along that there was a kind of silent majority in the Hong Kong community who were unhappy with the protests and would effectively, through this local council election, voice their discontent with the protests and throw their support behind the pro-Beijing parties. So that landslide victory in favor of all the pro-democracy parties, by all reports, genuinely caught Beijing off guard. It wasn't the result that they were expecting. So the immediate consequence was that we have now pan-democrat parties in control of all but one of Hong Kong's 17 district councils. In itself, not hugely significant. Obviously, local councils anywhere in the world are concerned with very sort of day-to-day street-level issues, but it was clearly an indication of the mood of the community. And as you said, this year we have coming up the far more important elections for Hong Kong's legislature, the Legislative Council elections. Now, the pro-democracy parties will be looking to hopefully repeat their success in trying to win as many seats as possible in that election. And Beijing, of course, will be doing their best to ensure that the same upset doesn't happen again. Now, Hong Kong's Legislative Council is an interesting body. It is the legislature, so it's the body that's responsible for passing Hong Kong's laws. Anything that Hong Kong wants to enact in terms of new laws and policies need to be approved by the legislature. However, the way it's constituted is effectively ensures that the pro-Beijing parties never win a majority of the popular vote, but always end up with a majority of the seats. And that's because some of the seats are what are called geographical constituencies, similar to seats in the Australian Parliament, in the Australian House of Representatives, rather. And the other half are so-called functional constituencies, which are seats representing different business and special interest groups. And they tend to go the way of the pro-Beijing business community who support them. So Beijing manages to, or at least until now, managed to always retain control of a majority of the Legislative Council. Now, already pro-democracy activists and politicians are talking about the possibility of even an upset as significant as them actually winning control of the Legislative Council. And that would be quite a remarkable turnaround. And I don't know if that's possible, but even so, them having a very significant majority, a very significant minority, gives them a voice in that Legislative Council, enables them to try to take control of committee processes and committee meetings, and really means that the government can't simply do whatever they want. And so there is a check and a balance on power to that extent. And the other important thing about both the District Council and the Legislative Council members is that they form a big chunk of the committee that elects Hong Kong's chief executive. The head of the Hong Kong government, and elections for the next chief executive, the current incumbent Carrie Lam, the next election will be in 2022. So if the pro-democracy parties get a large number of LegCo seats together with their district council seats from last year, that will give them a big enough chunk on that committee that they might be in a position to be kingmakers when it comes to the next chief executive election for Hong Kong. So there is some significance, and it's certainly going to be a very hotly contested election coming up later this year.
Thanks, Anthony. And that leads me on to asking you a more general question about governance in Hong Kong. There's a sense that, particularly after the Independent Commission Against Corruption was introduced, previously Hong Kong was notoriously corrupt, and that had quite a surprisingly rapid positive effect. There's a perception of Hong Kong having been competently governed, I would say, and in a reasonably objective way by sort of cool bureaucrats, of course, under the eye, first of all, of the British Colonial Office, or whichever office it was from Whitehall that administered Hong Kong, and then even in the early years after 1997, after the handover. And so the sort of people who were thrown up mostly as being chief executives too were people, Donald Tsang, for example, who was previously the finance secretary, seen as he acted quite coolly, in my view, during the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s and so on. What's happened to that governance cast, who seemed to be calm, unflappable, many of them very well educated, high rate of many degrees. Even Carrie Lam is someone I'd met a couple of times and thought was very sort of, I would say, not a person exuding charm, but a person with clearly cool intelligence, if you like. So what's happened there?
It's really a very good question, and I think even today the Hong Kong government just does display some characteristics of, I guess, schizophrenia, if you want to put it that way. In some respects, Hong Kong is still very well governed, and I think the response to the coronavirus has been a great example of that. They have done very well in terms of quarantine measures and border control, testing and contact tracing, and all those things that have enabled Hong Kong, notwithstanding its proximity to mainland China, where the virus broke out, to have managed things, at least thus far, very well, and much better than almost anywhere else in the world. So when it comes down to these sort of nitty-gritty administrative operational things, the Hong Kong government can still do well. And yet, as you say, there seems to be many respects in which they are not. And I think what it really perhaps comes down to is that Hong Kong's governors are really caught in an impossible position. And this begins at the chief executive and all the way down. They are on the one hand supposed to govern in the interests of the Hong Kong people and be thinking of and making decisions in the best interests of the livelihood of the Hong Kong people. But at the same time, they're ultimately answerable, and their mandate comes not from the Hong Kong people, but ultimately from Beijing. And so they are also simultaneously answerable to Beijing and what Beijing's perhaps policy preferences are. And they're in a way constantly looking over their shoulders and second guessing what they think Beijing might want them to do in any particular circumstance. And so it leaves the government in a near impossible position. And instead of making a commitment, as it were, and saying, look, we're going to do what we think's right for Hong Kong, and Beijing's going to have to live with that, or in the alternative, admitting that they are purely a colonial regime and saying, look, we're governing in the interests of the colonial power and the ordinary people suffer what they may, they're sort of caught in this constant position of being tugged in different ways, and therefore often unable to make any kind of decision when it comes to really important policy matters. And so Hong Kong has really drifted, in particular, over the last, say, 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. And before we sink even deeper into the content, sometimes in these discussions, because this is a writers' festival, I think it's important to ask you a little bit about the genesis of the book itself. Yes. And the writing of the book. You're a working lawyer, so you've got a daytime job as well, and I have to say, I feel a bit sick with envy with the skill with which you put together the complex narrative and themes in this book. Was it difficult to write? Did you keep a journal? And as for you, some people kindly call white people in Hong Kong guailos, foreigners. Has it been fairly easy for you to gain confidence of key players, as obviously you have done? Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the book itself.
Yeah, certainly. So I'd written previously, in the wake of the Umbrella Movement, a short book on the history of Hong Kong protest called The City of Protest. And at the time, the Umbrella Movement back in 2014 had been seen as the high point of civil disobedience in Hong Kong. And we had all, I think, in Hong Kong assumed that would remain the high point of civil disobedience in Hong Kong. But I already had some experience writing about and observing Hong Kong protest movements. So when the protests began last year, I spent a lot of time, obviously, attending the protests, writing about them, speaking to various people about them. And as the protests got larger, it already became apparent that I would have to respond to them somehow in my work. And as the protest went on even longer and became more complex, it became clear that that would have to be in the form of a new book to really make sense of everything that happened last year and contextualize it. So for really, from when the movement began last year in May, June, I'd begun both keeping a journal and writing for various, freelance articles for various media outlets and having various speaking engagements. So I'd spent a lot of time thinking and writing and talking about what had been happening and contextualizing it. And that was sort of how the material for the book developed. And when it got to the end of the year and the good people at Scribe agreed to publish the book and were very ambitious at wanting to have it come out as soon as possible after the events themselves. I sort of sat down and closeted myself away for a month with all of that material and sort of tried to pull it all together into the book that we have. But so it was certainly challenging. I was helped by the fact that I've already spent several years and done a lot of research on these things already. I'd also done some postgraduate study at the University of Hong Kong a few years ago on the umbrella movement and protest-related culture. And so all of that fed into this work. And really the challenge was trying to sort of wrangle the various strands of the narrative into a book that made sense, which I hope I did manage to do. But in terms of the question of access and my position as a foreigner, as it were, in Hong Kong, this is a couple of things helped. Firstly, I've been here a long time. I moved to Hong Kong in 1999 and have spent all the time since then, some 21 years, between Hong Kong and Beijing. I also lived many years in Beijing. I speak fluent Mandarin Chinese. My Cantonese is serviceable, not fluent, but it's okay. But I also can read and write Chinese. So when it comes to things like reading the protest slogans and posters and reading online posts in Chinese about the protests, I can do all of that. So that was all sort of helpful in terms of language access. And then in terms of access to people, whether it's on the streets or the politicians or other players involved, people here have just been incredibly open and engaged and friendly. And I think really there was a strong sense, in particular among the protesters, that they wanted their story to be told. So if anything, they were very welcoming of myself and other members of the international media. They indeed almost saw the international media as their allies in the protest movement in terms of helping have their story told to the world. And so there was a sense really that they were very keen to talk. But even going back to the umbrella movement and the grassroots community movement, the pro-democracy movement since then, there's a real sense, I think, that together with that movement, there's been something of a coming together in the Hong Kong community. And there's a real sense, I think, of solidarity, that if you're a Hong Konger, if you lived in Hong Kong for a long time and see yourself as a Hong Kong resident, regardless of your ethnicity, you're very much welcomed, and people embrace that. And it has been always one of Hong Kong's great strengths, that it's a very diverse place, a melting pot, a place where people gather from around the world, and that continues to be a strength of Hong Kong. And I think that's what has enabled me to be engaged with the issue and to be able to write this book ultimately.
That's great. Thanks, Anthony. In the book, you say at one stage, you're not a real Hong Konger if you haven't tasted tear gas. Yes. I'll ask you, obviously, have you tasted tear gas? And what does that mean? But then I'd like to extend that question in a way, if you could talk a bit about the attitude to the people who are firing the tear gas to the police. Because in past era, police in Hong Kong were viewed in a fairly benign way. A lot of police, actually, compared with many countries, you could see police walking on the streets very frequently, and but in my view, were not perceived as a tribe to themselves or some kind of enemy. And obviously, the police feature centrally in those marvelous, quite violent Hong Kong movies in which police are fighting triads and so on. So they're quite a celebrated force in many ways. obviously that's changed, and we have the violence of the protesters met by violence of the police, and I wonder if you could talk first of all, as I said, about what the tear gas means and whether you've suffered, and how the views of the police have changed, and why is that?
Yeah, certainly. The tear gas it really became one of the defining aspects of Hong Kong experience last year. But when we had the umbrella movement in 2014, police fired tear gas on one day, the first day of those protests, and that prompted such shock and outrage that the police should be firing tear gas on unarmed civilian protesters that thousands of people came out onto the streets in anger, and that prompted what ultimately became the umbrella movement, a 3-month occupation of the center of the city. And that was, as I said, one day in 2014. Now, in the course of the protest last year, we had tear gas fired on every single weekend but one for 7 months, and often fired on many other days during the week as well. So, and ultimately tear gas was fired in every single district across the city at certain points of the protests. And there were some days when there were very large-scale protests across the city where simultaneously tear gas was being fired in half a dozen different spots all the way across the city. Police really turned to tear gas as their primary means of policing crowds during the protest last year. Now, what was shocking was really two things. Firstly, the extent to which tear gas has been used, just so extensively in such huge numbers during the protests in Hong Kong, and also how quickly it was normalized. Unlike in 2014, the firing of tear gas didn't cause shock anymore. People expected it from the police, learned to deal with it, learned the right protective gear to wear against it, or various techniques for putting out the tear gas canisters. And it became, as I say, so normalized that there evolved this saying of, you're not a real Hong Konger if you haven't tasted tear gas, because so many Hong Kongers had been out on the streets and had been tear gassed by the police. And yes, I among them, having been a regular observer of the protests, had the experience of being tear gassed on many occasions. So it really became this central feature of Hong Kong experience last year. And now it had two interesting side effects. In terms of the people doing the tear gassing, it seemed clear that it was intended to have two effects. Firstly, the effect of dispersing a crowd, the effect of irritating a crowd with tear gas to make it uncomfortable and forcing them to disperse and flee the area. The psychological impact of the tear gas on people being gassed in terms of causing them to be frightened and disoriented and to lose the solidarity of the crowd. But it's also helpful, I think, from the people doing the gassing's point of view, from the police point of view, to turn a protest gathering into a riot. Once you gas a crowd and they turn into this seething, chaotic mass of people, some fighting back, some fleeing, I think it becomes easier then for the police to objectify the crowd and to treat them as criminals who are properly the subject of coercive policing tactics. I think it helps psychologically to help the police treat the crowds less like fellow citizens, less like fellow members of their community, and more like criminals. And that psychological effect was also seen in the terms of the people that were being tear gassed. It very quickly developed into an agent that built the solidarity of the crowd. And many times I'd seen the crowds hit by tear gas, they would disperse, but then as soon as the tear gas cleared, they would come back together again. They would reform the crowd, and they would often be chanting. And the chant they would be often chanting was "Hong Kong Yan Ga Yo," "Go Hong Kongers," this sort of identity-focused rallying cry. And this experience of being tear gassed and this sort of us and them experience dynamic that it built up really helped to build up the animosity of the people against the police. And that, together with many examples of police violence or overly coercive policing in the course of the protests last year, really caused a great deal of anger at the police. And it led to this change of dynamic that you were alluding to, Rowan, that previously the Hong Kong police were seen as a benign, highly respected police force, a police force known as Asia's finest, seen in the model of community policing, that they were with the support of the community and the consent of the community, helping to maintain law and order in the community. And it's a model that many civilized places such as Australia like to adhere to with their police forces. And Hong Kong had that. But in the course of the protests last year, with the tear gassing, with the violence, with the police being forced by the government to the front lines and being forced to use coercive law and order tactics to try and resolve this political problem, they became hated. And the model really shifted from this community policing model to a colonial policing model where the police have effectively become Beijing's enforcers on the ground in Hong Kong. And I think this is one of the great tragedies and great casualties of last year's protest movement has been the relationship between the Hong Kong people and their police force.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a bit about how Hong Kong people have been perceived in the past, including you, as you mentioned, you've lived in Beijing, by, let's say, the Mandarinate class of China. So it's not going back for some time that southern Chinese are kind of people interested in money. And if you give them the opportunity to make money, they'll be happy. And so, you know, Hong Kong, known for its tycoons, Deng Xiaoping enjoyed spending time with Hong Kong tycoons, it appears. And so quite a shock to find particularly young Hong Kongers don't seem to be so desperate to about their career prospects, about even Hong Kong's future economic prospects. They seem to have other priorities. How do you what's kind of a blow do you think this is to past thinking about Hong Kongers by people in northern China and other places about their priorities?
Yeah, no, I think you're quite right. This has been a common trope, whether in Beijing or in Whitehall or anywhere around the world, that Hong Kongers are apolitical, only interested in doing business and making money, and that as long as they're allowed to do that, they're not too fussed about their politics. And similarly, a generational thing that, you know, young people don't care about politics. They're interested in, I don't know, you know, computer games or what have you, and that they don't care about these issues. Now, I think those tropes were convenient for whoever was ruling Hong Kong at the time, as giving them a perhaps a false sense of comfort. And if you look indeed back at Hong Kong history, whether you go as recently as the Umbrella Movement in 2014, the protest movements of the 2000s, or even back to the 1960s, Hong Kongers have probably never been really as apathetic about politics as people might have liked to think they were. But certainly the events of last year you know, completely, I think, put the nail in the coffin of that particular impression of Hong Kongers. They clearly, and including the young generation in particular, care passionately about their home, about the way that it's governed, about all of these issues of politics that affect their day-to-day lives, and they are very willing to stand up and speak out for it. I think what was really interesting was that, notwithstanding all of that, notwithstanding the evidence on the streets of the city week in, week out last year, the Hong Kong government and Beijing still tried to frame these protests in terms of the economy. They sort of would say, well, this is really about housing affordability, or it's really about limited economic opportunity or limited job prospects for these young Hong Kongers. That's what they're really worried about. They're not really worried about politics. But if you go down the streets and speak to them, they will immediately reject that, and they'll say, of course, it's not about that. We care about the politics. And indeed, some protesters would joke with me that either about the rumors that they were only here because of housing prices, or the rumors that they were only here because they were indeed being paid to protest by some nefarious foreign forces. You know, again, I guess that feeds into that trope of Hong Kongers only caring about money. That, you know, this wasn't happening, and they were there because they cared passionately about the political issues that they were protesting about. So I think one of the unfortunate things is that this failure of imagination seems to be continuing to persist in Beijing in particular, and they're hoping that if they can sort of calm Hong Kong down, fix the housing market, improve the economy, Hong Kong will all of a sudden be happy. And I think they're going to find that that's not necessarily the case.
And to an extent, what you're describing appears to me to be a part of the perception from Beijing of how to subdue the long-traveled borderlands of China more broadly. So with Tibet, Xinjiang, and if we can call Taiwan a Chinese borderland, that somehow giving people economic opportunities is the answer. And it would it would appear to be a big priority of Xi Jinping, a very powerful man in China, probably the most powerful person since Mao Zedong, and his key doctrine is, of course, socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. This is not the Deng Xiaoping old era of, and it was under that old era that the concept of one country, two systems was devised. It would seem, would you agree that it would seem that for Xi Jinping, one country, two systems is not very interesting? He's really interested in the one country part of this, and ideally one system, and that we see this in how Beijing is approaching those other places which are also called autonomous regions. So Hong Kong is in a setting of a bigger train of events and challenges inside China.
Yes, I think you're quite right. Xi Jinping is interested, firstly in the unity of China and the unity of party rule across all of China, including those restive fringes that you mentioned, from Xinjiang through to Tibet to Hong Kong, and indeed ultimately to reunifying Taiwan. And then he's also interested in projecting that power globally. So I think he's interested in pulling together that one China as a superpower, and then through his Belt and Road Initiative and other initiatives, projecting that power globally. And so I think it's another reason why this insubordination that's been shown by Hong Kong over the last year will not be tolerated by Xi Jinping. And there's certainly no mood in Beijing for some sort of political compromise with Hong Kong's Democrats. It's all about maintaining party rule and ultimately projecting it.
So where do you think this is going to go? And certainly in Australia and in other Western countries, amongst people who felt very supportive of Hong Kongers wishing to demonstrate how much they value Western democratic values, rule of law. Nevertheless, there's a sort of sense of the ominous history of Tiananmen in 1989. Is this going to end up like that? And when I was in Hong Kong the last couple of times, my friends there have talked about, even inside Hong Kong, the split between the yellows and the blues, people who broadly support pro-democratic protests and the people who support the government. There are different shades of yellow and blue, but families are divided. And a friend of mine said this is probably going to go on for decades. And you mentioned in your book what my friend talked about. Northern Ireland is a sort of model of these sorts of set views going on for some time. That's but maybe Beijing, maybe Xi Jinping will at some stage suddenly say enough, and then events will suddenly accelerate towards a more terrible conclusion. You suggest in the book that you don't feel that's likely to happen. Maybe you could talk a bit about how generally people in Hong Kong are now shifting into more or less settled camps, and where this is all heading in the future.
Yeah, I think we certainly are set for an extended period of ongoing instability in Hong Kong. As you say, I don't think that there's necessarily going to be any kind of violent crackdown in Hong Kong from Beijing. Hong Kong still has a great deal of value to China, and notwithstanding that it's a much smaller share of the overall GDP than it used to be. As a financial center, it's still incredibly valuable to mainland Chinese companies, including the state-owned enterprises, and they want to see Hong Kong continue as a financial center. So I think any kind of drastic action that would ultimately compromise that is not necessarily or it's not likely on the cards. But certainly in terms of the day-to-day life for the people, the human rights situation for political activists and protesters, and indeed even the life at the neighborhood level, where you have certain neighborhoods tending to become more yellow pro-democracy neighborhoods and perhaps other neighborhoods tending to be more pro-Beijing neighborhoods, we're starting to see these deepening social divisions. And if that God forbid, is coupled with an increase of even higher level of violence than what we've seen, then this Northern Ireland situation is something that people have been talking about as something that would be a horrific destination for Hong Kong to end up at. But it does seem like we're at the beginning, at least, of a path that could ultimately lead in that direction if steps aren't taken to prevent it. But even assuming hopefully we don't reach that stage, we are definitely in for, I think, an ongoing push and pull. There will be, Beijing will continue through various means, or using all the tools in its toolkit, from political intervention to the so-called united front mechanisms that it has at its disposal throughout Hong Kong society, through the political system, through the police, to put pressure on anti-government activists and pro-democracy politicians. In return, the protesters will push back. There will continue to be large street protests when key issues arise. There'll continue, I think, to be this bubbling dissident movement, and they'll be pushing back and forth against the other, I think, for some time to come. And it's hard to see where it ends up. And to a certain extent, I can't help feeling that this is just Hong Kong. This is the way it is. And until there is some really significant change, whether a crackdown from above or a significant demographic shift in the makeup of the Hong Kong population, or something else that causes a fundamental shift here, we're going to continue to see these struggles playing out over many years to come.
And Christian people seem to have played quite an intriguing role in the protests so far. Is that?
Yes, that's right. Many of the protest leaders have strongly identified with the Christian faith. So Joshua Wong, the very prominent young protest leader, is very outspoken about his Christian faith. Some of the other protest leaders from the Umbrella Movement, Benny Tai, Chan Kin Man. There was also a Reverend Chu, who was also a protest leader. So there have been many religious leaders who also have been protest leaders. The former Cardinal Zen in Hong Kong, a Catholic cardinal here, also very outspoken, and still to this day very outspoken on political matters and matters of democracy. So there's been a significant overlap between the protest movement and activists and people from the Christian faith in particular. And part of that, I think, is that religious freedom is such a key issue, and something that, again, a freedom that Hong Kong has that is not freely exercised in the mainland, this freedom of religion, which many people that have strong religious faith here obviously hold dearly and see as being threatened if Beijing's influence increases here. So I think that partly motivates people with strong religious faiths to be increasingly involved as activists in the protest movement as well.
Thanks very much, Anthony. My last question is just briefly about Australia. There are a lot of Hong Kong people who Australian citizens and born in Hong Kong, have Hong Kong permanent ID cards and travel between the two. The families are, some are in one country and some are in the other. If you could say something about what Australians might play, or what you see, you must know one or two of those people, their views of what's going on.
Yeah, of course. Australia played, perhaps accidentally, a very key role in the protests last year, because when the protests were breaking out, and many of the protesters were young university students, other members of the Hong Kong diaspora around the world began staging their own protests in sympathy with the events in Hong Kong. And because at the time it was summer vacation in the Northern Hemisphere, but universities were still in session in Australia, Australia was one of the first places where we saw these clashes on university campuses between the pro-Hong Kong protesters and pro-Beijing antagonists. And eventually these sorts of clashes played out on campuses around the world, but Australia was really the first place where this happened. And so, in a way, Australia was at the forefront of that movement, and at the forefront of a broader movement of the Hong Kong protests, in the end, having effects around the world. And I think at the same time, the Hong Kong protests helped to bring awareness of something that had been growing simultaneously through a number of different channels, or for a number of different reasons in Australia, of the role of Chinese influence in Australia on Australian politics and business. And I think the Hong Kong protest really served to sharpen that and give a focus to that, and give a very potent visual image of that with the protesters on Hong Kong streets week in, week out. And again, that's something that I think was the significance of last year's protests globally, that they served as a means of the world starting to think about Chinese influence in ways that they haven't done before. So I think that's the first lesson that Australia has taken from this, and we now see at policy levels much more vigorous debate about China. Now, unfortunately, sometimes the term of that debate moves into, frankly, xenophobic and racist discourse, but that doesn't mean that there aren't sensible policy discussions to be had, and it's good to see that those discussions are being had increasingly in Australia. And then, of course, there's a role for Australia to play in continuing to be aware of what's happening in Hong Kong and speaking out about what's happening in Hong Kong. And it was good to see, after the arrests of those pro-democracy activists a few weeks ago, the foreign minister made a very strong statement. Law societies in Australia also made a strong statement, given that many of those arrested were also barristers and solicitors in Hong Kong. And I think from the Hong Kong activists' point of view, continuing to have international attention to their cause, they see as valuable, at least that China knows the world is watching, and at least that there's hope that will spare Hong Kong from some of China's worst excesses. But it does, at the end of the day, come down to people, as you say, and there are many people who live their lives between Hong Kong and Australia. Certainly the events of last year perhaps caused some people to question that and question where would be the appropriate place for them to be in the long term. At the same time, it's made Hong Kong an interesting and dynamic place to be. I think in many ways, Hong Kong is more exciting now than it's been at any time in the last 20 years, notwithstanding the political situation. And so I think I just hope that those exchanges continue, and that the strong connections between Australia and Hong Kong continue, and the care and concern in both directions it carries on. I think it's ultimately good for both places.
Well, thank you very much, Antony. Thank you for your terrific book. Thanks for this chat. Thanks again to Scribe Publisher, Bendigo Venues and Events, and of course, Bendigo Writers Festival. And thank you everyone for watching this conversation, and keep watching this space in Hong Kong. It's an exciting space. Who knows what's going to happen next? Thank you very much. Cheerio.
Thank you, Rowan, for hosting. Thank you.